Where is this thing called God, then? God's nowhere in the universe.
God might be in the human body. But you need to think about bodies in a new way. Usually we just think that the human body is an unreliable witness of reality.
Well, it is. Pre-modern human understanding was compromised by human feelings. Ignorance, fear, and awe led humans to worship gods. But we're now on the way to true knowledge of reality.
What you call truth is power and control, which you worship. It's your faith.
Faith can't transport you along the motorway at 70 miles an hour. Science has given us knowledge and power. We have power because rational consciousness has liberated us from the human body and led us to the truth.
That's right. The modern world has little time for religion. It's something that gets in the way of what you call truth. It's only ever a human delusion. Once, this Sri Lankan man was under threat of a death sentence. He was let off and has since performed this penance annually to thank a Hindu god, Kataragama. Who now thinks anything is gained by this sort of behavior?
There is a kind of pointlessness and therefore an apparent irrationality about religious gestures, which marks them off, I think, very clearly from the gestures we use towards other human beings. Now, there are societies nowadays where those gestures are less and less frequently employed. Like, I suppose, Britain, parts of America would be prime cases. And we think of those places, those cultures, as very materialistic cultures. Ones in which everything's actually supposed to be rather functional. Because everything is about progress, getting on, achieving your ends, your ambitions, getting your rewards. And the uselessness of religion makes it simply not fitted for a society like that. It's a waste of time.
The world is now a machine. Its functions don't involve gods.
From the sun's awesome furnace, from the deep bowels of the earth, nature's elemental forces have raged long before man's coming. Over the eons, man has feared their erratic, destructive power. He has offered up prayer and sacrifice to wrathful gods of sea and wind, to the deathly chill of the oncoming ice, to the torrential floodwaters, and to the terrible twisting force that dropped from the heavens. Then man began the slow turn away from witchcraft and superstition to the discipline of science. He fashioned crude instruments that set him on the path toward understanding the riddle of the elements. He developed ways to measure the relationship between...
The triumph of science.
Yes. Through scientific reason, we moderns have come to a true understanding of reality. Reality consists of knowable quantities, the facts of matter. That's all there is in the world. So God has been eliminated from modern inquiries.
My own view is that if God exists, that's a fact of science like any other.
There couldn't be a conflict between science and religion because by definition, each is trying to state the truth. And if God exists, let's suppose that for the sake of argument that God exists and created the universe and that there is a divine force in the universe, then those are facts of physics. Then the existence of God is a physical fact like any other. Now, once you put it that way, then it seems to me extremely unlikely. There just isn't enough evidence to suppose that God exists and that there is a divine force in the universe.
Once, our ancestors kept the bones of long-dead saints to venerate them. You now gaze with wonder and pride at the bones of animals. They tell you how much you know about the rational classification of all the items in the universe, according to function and status. It's precisely the absence of an exhibit we could label God, which has made religion irrelevant and pointless.
A lot of people have assumed that at the end of the day, God is an item in the world, an object among other objects, although a very, very special one. Of course, he has all kinds of extra special properties. He happens to know everything and he happens to be everywhere. But when you've got the sentences right, when you've pinned down those properties, you know where God is to be mapped on the territory of reality. And the trouble with that position is that it's very vulnerable indeed to people who say, well, as a matter of fact, we can map the territory very exhaustively and we don't see where an object like that could fit in.
For you moderns, God doesn't fit in. Religious faith has not flourished. And this hostile climate has shaped what little religion has survived. Survival has meant evolving special camouflage, an appearance of rationalism.
Now, the faith in reason during the Enlightenment was such that it was believed that reason could illuminate all things, that nothing escaped the grasp of reason. In matters of religion, this meant that religion was thoroughly comprehensible through reason. That is to say, religion is essentially rational. Through careful reflection and investigation, one can discern the rational core of religious belief and practice.
Religion has become a kind of pseudo-scientific exercise performed by rationally detached individuals. Typically, as in Protestantism, the power of individual reason and conscience has become paramount.
Along with a kind of heavy emphasis on individual conversion experiences that came out of Protestantism, particularly in the 18th century, a rationalist emphasis that was by no means uninfluential in the churches, leading one to think about religion as something that one figures out in the privacy of one's own mind, so to speak, and decides upon in terms of its truth or falsity. The notion then that religion is adherence to a set of propositions. Does God exist? Is Jesus Christ the Son of God, or what does that mean? That these are questions that one figures out rationally by considering the Bible texts and considering possible philosophical options, and then comes to a conclusion, and then maybe involves oneself in a religious life or not.
Rationalism, my foot. A great deal of religious energy is also spent on denying the explanatory power of science.
I don't think evolution is science. I think it's science fiction. And I think that it's something, probably the greatest hoax that has ever been perpetrated on the people of America and the world.
Christians, like these fundamentalists, called creationists, believe that the theory of evolution is wrong because it contradicts the biblical account of creation. They base all of their claims about reality on the Bible because they say it's indisputably the Word of God, but that's just their view. Claiming that you have some special kind of authority is a traditional way of passing mumbo-jumbo off as truth. The Catholic Church, to protect their authority, crushed Galileo when he proved that the Earth moved around the sun. Science provides knowledge. Now even the Catholic Church sees that. It recognizes Galileo's claim.
Yes, most people now think that truth equals science. But you people who believe only in scientific truth have got something in common with religious rationalists and with fundamentalists.
Historically, there have been moments, especially in the 18th century, when the Christian Church seems to have got itself locked into the idea that there's one way of knowing things. When you know the truth, you know the whole truth, and you know it in ways that you can set out very clearly and efficiently. And that, of course, goes hand in hand with the increasing cultural assumption that there's one way of knowing, and it's scientific knowing. One result of that has been, very oddly, a kind of symbiosis between that sort of rationalism and fundamentalism. The rationalist 18th century Christian says we can know what God is like and what the universe is like by fairly neutral forms of argumentation and observation. The fundamentalist says we don't depend on observation in the way you mean, we certainly don't depend on the scientific worldview, but we depend on revealed literature and texts. We depend on a set of propositions that maps out exactly what it's like for God to be God and the world to be the world in relation to God. And one of the things which I think we've come to recognize in recent years is the way in which what we call fundamentalism in the 19th and 20th centuries is the child of rationalism. Yet again, it sees the world in these terms of charting clear propositional accounts. So part of what the agenda must be, I think, for a theology that's trying to grow beyond that is to ask, is there one way of knowing? Do we have to say if we know the truth, we know the whole truth in that way?
There is only one way of knowing what's in the world.
No, you can choose to see the world in many ways. How we see reality is always dependent upon a human choice about how to represent the world. Reality is shaped by human concepts. We carve up the real world into different kinds of objects. Fish, as opposed to jellyfish, for example. We see similarities between some objects and not others. Science is just a human way of looking at the world. Science isn't a neutral engagement with reality. It's a card house of human conceptions. Change one conception and the whole lot will come down. All scientific theories are open to endless revision. They're not the truth. They're human work in progress. All human ideas about the world depend on prior judgments about how we're going to see what's in front of us. To some extent, humans see what they want. They can even create what they want to see. Try telling a scientist with an overdraft that it's unreal. Money is just a fact of human conceptual life. All human cultures embody concepts of reality which shape what we see and how we behave. These Mexican Indians perform a dance celebrating a Spanish victory over the Moors. Their ancestors acquired this dance from Spanish colonists. It still shapes their behavior now. Is it less real than an overdraft or atoms? Whether you see atoms or money or anything is always filtered through the concepts and values of a culture. And what makes human beings into animals who can absorb culture is language.
I can never stand fully outside language because it's language that gives me an identity, that gives me a sense that there are some things that I can take for granted, some things that I assume are valuable. Without some fixed positions of that kind, our minds would just be a booming, buzzing confusion. So we have some ability to round upon the assumptions in language, but at some point it seems that we have to go along with language.
The only world we can know is by going along with language. It's a world that's been prepared earlier by other human beings. There are 5,000 different ways of seeing the world through language. We inherit the world English serves up. Nag, hack, pony, thoroughbred. Not all languages see those different kinds of horse.
As English people, we don't choose to speak English. We're taught English. It's the language we're born into. And of course, English embodies in its vocabulary and the structure of its sentences, the way it's put together, all kinds of ways of cutting up, splitting up the world, all kinds of values, many different sets of priorities. It tells us what to avoid and the kind of things we should aim for.
Humans look at the world through cultural and linguistic filters. These different filters create different worlds, not just different perspectives on the same one. That's because language is more than a device for labeling objects or even concepts. Language is a creative, expressive medium through which humans create meanings and values.
You can see that language has lots of uses, and the idea that sometimes people have that language is basically there to help us describe things, right? Represent reality, and then we can use the representations for various purposes. We can give people orders by giving them a representation they should carry out, or ask them questions by giving them a representation where they answer yes or no. But basically we represent and describe. That really misses out a whole lot in language. Some of the uses of language create or bring about something.
Do you love me?
Sure.
Well, why didn't you tell me more often?
Because you keep asking me.
Now, a lot of language is concerned with changing our relationships with each other and our relationships with people, putting them on new footings. And this is reflected in very important parts of language, in the kind of modes of address that we have, in the type of words that we choose in addressing somebody as against somebody else.
May I have it back now, please?
I'm sorry, Miss Francis. Yes, of course.
Do you think everyone could call me Sarah? Then I might feel less of a new girl.
Oh, I think we might manage that. After all, you work as if you've been here for years.
Language, as it were, makes and unmakes human relations. This is the dimension of language where it does something and sets out something as against simply describing something. And nor can these two be neatly separated, because a great deal of our description of social reality trades on and builds on the kinds of things we set up first in language and then later find descriptive words for. You wouldn't understand the descriptive words for being on an intimate footing if you didn't understand with somebody, if you didn't understand what it was to address somebody and set up an intimate footing.
Elliot Manson.
Mm-hmm.
I thought you were asleep.
Language has a vast expressive and creative role in our lives. It's the way in which humans create frameworks which shape what we see in the world and how we behave.
very form of the Victorian.
You're very beautiful.
There's an enormous range of humanly created frameworks. Honor, for example. At this moment, Albert Einstein could see that there was more than mass, energy, and time in the human world. The way in which these French people behaved in 1945 towards women they suspected of being collaborators was shaped by ideas of right and wrong and justice. Ideas about the human world, such as justice, honor, shame, guilt, are all humanly created frameworks. You can only see their shades and distinctions through language. You can't talk to a dog about different kinds of justice. Much of reality is shaped by meanings created and shared in languages. Humans create many different ways of valuing and giving meaning to their world. Are there any limits? It's possible that God is also a human way of thinking about the world. Perhaps it's the idea of God that makes God possible.
Language enables your relationship to the world. I mean, if you haven't got the concepts, you can't see the thing. There's a story about Captain Cook arriving in New Zealand and with his great ship and its wonderful white sails and so on, and the natives who were there fishing paid no attention to it. And this was explained by saying that it was so outside their range of concepts that it was invisible. Now, this sets up all sorts of trains of thought. One might think that one is constantly being surrounded by angels or extraterritorials or something, and one just hasn't got the conceptual gear to see them.
Could God be the way some humans choose to value some human perspectives?
I think you're trying to cheat. God has always been something mysterious, but which still existed somewhere. He was an inadequate explanation for physical events we now explain properly. There's no evidence for utterly mysterious agencies in the universe. God was a particular historical human delusion. You're now trying to change the rules to keep the religious game going.
It's quite possible that if God existed, that he might manifest himself in all sorts of different ways that we couldn't even conceive of at present. But it is absolutely essential not to fudge, not to be dishonest about this. And the contemporary form of the dishonesty is very ingenious. The way it goes is this. It says, there is this thing called God talk. There's this religious talk. And you mustn't suppose that it actually stands for anything in the real world. It's just a kind of talk. Now, my own view is that if you really take that seriously, that's the death of religion. Because I think it has a kind of built-in inconsistency. Indeed, I would be willing to say a kind of built-in dishonesty. It wants to keep the same verbal forms, but deny them their meaning. It wants to allow the person to say, I believe in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and not believe a word of it. It's just a whole lot of words.
If the only things that are real are the descriptions of forces which govern the movement of matter, then God isn't real. Not all of human reality is experienced in terms of matter and energy and forces, though. Are honor, shame, justice, and overdrafts unreal? The question of what's real for humans depends on human values and meanings. God might be one of them. Does this mean God is just a habit of language and behavior? Well, there is nothing you can point to. And much of Christian tradition has believed that there is no object which corresponds to God.
In large parts of the Christian tradition, it's been taken for granted that talking about God is not, in fact, like talking about an object. And that's been expressed in the patristic and the medieval periods of theology by people saying, well, God is not a being, or even God is beyond being, which is odd and paradoxical language, but it doesn't mean that God doesn't exist, simply that God doesn't belong in any category. One of the things which a later philosophical theology rather loses sight of is that long tradition, very much interwoven with Christian mysticism, which assumes that when you talk about God, you're not talking about an item in the world, but about the context of the universe itself, about that within which or in the light of which objects or items make sense.
Modern culture sees the world as only matter, an instrument for human purposes. However, to find space for religion doesn't require finding new objects in this world. Simply looking at it differently might be a start. To Aborigines, Ayers Rock is a holy place. Religion can grow out of ways of seeing meaning in the world, meanings quite different from modern ones. These meanings shape behavior. But you can't understand religious behavior in terms of rational functionalism either. Religious behavior is connected to the expressive human creativity that also shows up in language.
The picture of language as relating to the world as something out there which it describes is very, very inadequate. And a huge amount of human life and experience is led in a quite different way. I mean, I've talked about the interhuman ways that happens, but of course, the entire religious life of human beings is shot through with this kind of use of language to set up a relationship. Prayer, invocation, and so on, is meant to set up a relationship. You go back to so-called primitive religions and you find a way of, through ritual, invoking and setting up a relationship with a totem animal or whatever, which involves putting the people concerned into a certain rapport with what's out there. And so all that is something which is completely, you miss the point of if you think of it simply as descriptions. Certain attempts to understand other societies by putting them in that structure and saying, what kind of descriptions of the world are involved in a rain dance or something of that kind, are always going to miss an important part of the point of what's going on here.
Religious behavior isn't about trying to understand the movements of atoms. To a modern, it's therefore meaningless. It has no measurable truth value.
Okay. It's a way of expressing these peculiar human values. But why should we bother with them now? Why do we need them?
Right to the rocky road, bring Charlie Marlin, call you. Right to the rocky road, bring Charlie Marlin, call you. Them dry goods, girl, we no chat to them.
Jamaican slaves used to sing this song. It set a work rhythm, but it also expressed feelings.
Bring Charlie Marlin, call you. Right to the rocky road. Bring Charlie Marlin, call you. Right to the rocky road, bring Charlie Marlin, call you. Right to the rocky road, bring Charlie Marlin, call you.
Much human behavior is not about being simply rational. In sorrow and joy, humans are very obviously possessed by more than rationalism. It may be that religious feelings and behavior are equally human.
There's a certain sense which I want to say we are religious animals. You don't have to be terribly intellectual to be religious, and you don't have to be a failed intellectual either. It's not that only really rather old-fashioned and stupid people can be religious nowadays. And we're discovering that's not the case. But we have to find ways in our society of releasing the power of those religious gestures and enabling people to do them without feeling stupid, without feeling uneducated, or in revolt against education and against the intellect. Precisely because it's animal, we can't forget about it, because that's what we are. If a humanist or an old-fashioned atheist says, I'm rejecting all that because I've explained it, I'd say he's rejecting himself, because he's also one of us animals.
Are you saying we're just animals?
Human animals, not demigods.
But you're still saying human reality is just animal and instinctive.
No, that's not the key to understanding human behavior either. There may be animal elements in our behavior, but they're always filtered through language and culture. You can't step outside language to find a pure human essence. Culture interprets and manages the animal in us. That's as true of religious behavior as of any other human behavior.
The idea that we could reach a pure essence, a pure animal basis, the foundation of all religion, is one that sets up all kinds of intellectual problems. Who is it that's doing the looking? Me. Who am I? Formed by the language that I speak and the language that's spoken to me and the history that's happened to me. I am looking through those spectacles all the time. Who am I talking to or with? Another person, likewise formed by his or her language and culture. And that means that my idea of what counts as an essence, as a basis, is not going to be innocent and abstract. And the trouble with a lot of talk about dialogue between religions is that we somehow think there must be an innocent and obvious idea of what the essence of religion is. And yet if you put 5 or 6 scholars of religion together and ask them what the essence of religion might be, you'll get 5 or 6 very different answers because you have 5 or 6 very different histories talking to you.
Human language and culture may well respond to the fact of human bodies. But the human being we see through language is always an interpretation. We can't find a neutral picture of a pure human being. There's no escaping human interpretations, not in science, not in religion, not anywhere. Human meaning is like architecture. It's always built at a particular time in a particular place. It's the interpretation of a particular culture. It changes, as cultures do, from place to place, from time to time, and over time. There is no pure meaning that stands outside culture. No building not built by particular humans. Recognizing that humans can't have a neutral, pure picture of the world underlies what's called postmodernism. This recognition profoundly changes how we think about religion. What specifically might it mean for Christianity, the religion of our culture? There is no pure form of Christianity. Christianity is a particular subculture with its own history of meaning. Just take the history of the Bible. Knowing what the Bible might mean is not the least of the problems. The Bible has been a rich source of meaning for Jews and Christians for thousands of years. The Bible was originally the record of the meanings and interpretations of cultures very different from our own. Those meanings have been filtered by 2,000 years of cultural changes, translations, commentaries, and church traditions.
What seems obvious in one generation as a mainstream strand in the biblical narrative will look different in a different generation. You will look for different things in the Bible depending on where you now stand. You look for different things in the Christian tradition itself depending on where you now stand. So it's not just a kind of idle trendiness to say that you can get out of the Bible or the Christian tradition a rather different view of the position of women, say, from that which has ordinarily been taken for granted. That's simply the way in which the reading of the Bible has always worked. The questions you ask come from your context. The answers you have are dictated totally neither by your context nor by the text in front of you, but emerge in the engagement between the two.
Now you're saying that there's no Christian meaning either. At least we know where we are with Orthodox Christians who know what they believe.
Yes, it's comforting to believe that Scripture contains clear messages about what we should do and believe. But those are also interpretations. Knowing what this historical narrative might mean and how it can shape a life now is the difficult bit. That requires a special kind of imagination.
That was the very day young Hamlet was born. He that's mad and sent into England. I'm Mary, why did he sent into England? Why, because he was mad. He shall recover his wits there, or if he do not, 'tis no great matter there.
One could say that our relationship as Christians to the Bible is rather like that of an actor who's performing Hamlet to the text of the play Hamlet. The text of the play doesn't stand before him simply as an object to be known about, nor even as a set of unambiguous instructions for how he's to perform the role. It more stands before him as a kind of problem to be solved, which is only resolved in his performance.
This same skull, sir, was Yorick's skull, the king's jester. Yes? E'en that. Let me see. Alas. Poor Yorick.
The Bible constitutes a constant problem and challenge for Christians. They have to know what it means, they have to take decisions about the way best to embody it in their everyday lives. And in this way, they are constantly imitating Christ, who, according to the Bible, is the very image of God himself.
What to imitate? Shifting biblical interpretations mean that there is no fixed ground on which to build. No interpretation can be final. Take new feminist interpretations of the story of creation, for example.
The story of Adam and Eve has been the locus of interpretation throughout the centuries. It's been used to explain why women should be submissive. It's been used to explain that women are secondary, that women are evil. They're responsible for the evil and the death in the world. And just recently, there's been a revisionist effort by feminist biblical scholars who'd like to look at the same story very carefully and say, no, the story doesn't say those things. Those are interpretations born of patriarchy. But their effort is also to look for an original, objective meaning in the text. And to that extent, they're engaged in the same quest that the patriarchal interpreters were engaged in. What does the text really mean? If we can uncover its neutral meaning, its objective meaning, well, then we'll really have it. But the problem is, meaning is never neutral. It's always contingent upon cultural and social circumstances. It's always in flux.
What does this mean for churches established on foundations of settled truths?
Quite. There are no foundations. So, are the church's citadels built to defend a covenant of orthodoxy? There are contrary impulses.
There are many people now, I mean, I'm thinking of people in the Church of England, and people with clerical collars on too, who are worried about the literalism of the traditional interpretations of Christianity, but want to live on with Christianity. I feel this myself. I mean, I feel that there is a mystical Christ just as there is a mystical Buddha. I mean, Buddhists don't think that I mean, they know that Buddha was just a man, but then there are images of Buddha which represent what he represented, and this we might feel about Christ. But of course, the institution of religion very often works against such persons. There is a sort of narrowing of the possibilities presented to us, perhaps, by people who say, well, what you're doing isn't religion. Religion means that you have these dogmatic beliefs or follow these particular rituals.
Recently, people have become more and more conscious of the way in which fundamentalism and rationalism are part of the same problem. The same willingness to map the world in exhaustive, efficient, exact ways. And if we want to grow beyond that in faith and in theology, clearly the question is how we in our language convey and articulate the sense of being engaged by reality, engaging with reality. How we articulate a sense of faithfulness to what's pushed at us, and at the same time maintain a proper humility, proper silence and provisionality about what we're saying. It's really then about developing an idea of religious truth-telling, which doesn't depend on the full catalogue of propositions which will tell you all you want to know about God and the world.
In the past, Christianity has adapted itself to different times and places. Is Christianity going to continue to be a source of meanings and myths?
Christianity is changing all around us. No religion stands outside the flux of history. Seeing belief and practice as revisable may challenge orthodoxy, but it may also offer the only possibility of a future for Christianity. Those attached to current Orthodox Christian meanings may have overlooked just how much Christian practice has changed during 2,000 years.
Religions are live, developing traditions. St. Paul couldn't have possibly foreseen, shall we say, the current shape of Christianity. He would most probably find it unrecognizable. And yet, that's not to say that it's an invalid or inauthentic development of Christianity in St. Paul's day.
How can you decide what's an authentic development of Christianity?
It has to grow out of Christian traditions and meanings.
But it looks as if you can quarry any old meanings you want. Surely that's going to lead to distortions which challenge even the most elastic idea of what Christianity could be.
There's no pure Christianity.
To say that postmodernism creates novel possibilities for the religious imagination does not, of course, mean that the product of these reflections will be recognizable in traditional or orthodox forms. Indeed, postmodernism will call into question every form of religious orthodoxy. What will result from a rethinking of religious faith from a postmodern perspective is not a single set of beliefs, but forms of belief that are in constant flux, in constant change, open to constant revision.
Accepting that Christian meanings change with other human meanings means, of course, that you can't predict precisely what will happen to Christian practice. Which beliefs may be appropriate to changed human needs and purposes. Impossible to say whether humans will even still need what God might mean. There is no kind of worship that is, in itself, postmodern.
Postmodern worship would have to include a recognition that this particular mode of worship is one among many, that there are other ways to worship God that are equally authentic. Not only see that as something to be grudgingly admitted, but recognize and celebrate the fact that there are variegated and different approaches to God.
Worshippers are likely to reject much current practice, born of rationalism and fundamentalism. This service at St. James's Piccadilly in London mixes Christian practice with Eastern religious practices. But postmoderns might also look to neglected parts of the Christian tradition.
In my view, the postmodern mood in Christian theology is a critical reappropriation of certain things in our heritage which are rather distinctively Jewish. Since we know that Christianity emerges as really kind of a branch of Judaism, this shouldn't be surprising. Now, what it is reappropriating is, first of all, the notion that God is a mystery whose name even cannot be spoken, and a replica of whom should not be made. That suspicion of anything like that has been there throughout the Jewish tradition from the very beginning. Christians, however, have not always respected or understood the power of that idea as much, and we've done more in the effort to package, to channel, to include in authoritative doctrines and so on through many years, this access to God.
Mystery, awe, and wonder. How our bodies respond shapes reality more than modern culture accepted. It may be that people will continue to find truths in religious behavior. The Christian narrative, too, may continue to offer meanings out of which humans can make truths. Redemption, heaven, God.
In the modern era, we're much more aware of our position as influenced by history and as constructed through language. We realize much more forcefully that all human knowledge is bound up with certain subjective decisions taken not simply by individuals, but by cultures as a whole. In a certain sense, it's true that cultures and religions constantly reinvent God. They constantly make up what God is like. And yet the difficult point is not to suppose that this means that God doesn't really exist. On the contrary, our mode of access to the reality of God may be precisely that creative force that runs through human language and civilization.